It all started with a very small naval base. The Russians had a naval base in Tartus in Syria, a small port, fishing, smuggling, nothing much. And they started to expand it, and we, of course, did not pay much attention. I, for my sins, have written a lot about Russian naval ambitions. Russia historically is not the major naval power, never was. It is a major land power in Eastern Hemisphere, in Eurasia, always was. But if you go back as early as 1799, and there'll be a lot of history today because I'm trying to put it in some kind of perspective and extrapolate from that what may be happening in the future. So the base in Tartus, not a big deal. They had a repair facility there. And then we started seeing that they may be putting some anti-air elements, well, to protect the base, not a big deal. But when you read Russian sources, you see that they're talking about coming back to new bases in the Mediterranean. There's rapprochement with Egypt that I've written about a couple of years ago. There is an incessant lament about Libya going down. Libya was a major client for weapons, and historically there were some anchorage there. There were bases in Egypt, including in Alexandria, before 1972. Henry Kissinger engineered Russia, Soviet Union, to be pushed out of there. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at both naval power projection into Syria and historically into the Med. It is connected to the Crimean operation, to seizure of the Crimea, because from the 18th century, Russia placed its Black Sea fleet in Sevastopol, and then from there into the Mediterranean, as we saw in 1799 capture of Corfu by Admiral Ushakov, and then into the Indian Ocean through Egypt in the Soviet era, the Socotra Island offshore Yemen, and further out into the Blue Ocean, into the Indian Ocean. So is that the only power projection scenario we're looking at? No. We also see a ground cooperation between Russia, Iran, Syria, and the Syrian proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon, now fighting in Syria. What does that mean? It means that a land corridor from Iran through Iraq, which is predominantly Shia, and then they have a challenge of Sunni-controlled areas in the Anbar province and elsewhere, and ISIS, and then into Syria and towards the Mediterranean. So that considerably changes the map of the Middle East as we know it, and as the British and French colonial ministries and foreign ministries drafted it in 1916 by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Russians and the Iranians are not the only ones who talk about the change of Sykes-Picot. Another group that talks about it is ISIS. So, if the Russians are in Syria, what are they doing? Well, it's the first deployment of the Russian force outside of the borders of the former Soviet Union, bar none. The deployment in Afghanistan was also outside of the borders of the Soviet Union, but started in 1979. Vietnam, Cam Bay, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola, these are all Soviet imperial endeavors. I fondly remember the cost of empire studies out of the Rand Corporation by Charlie Wolf in the 70s that I reviewed in my PhD work and decided that this was one of the contributing factors. The imperial overstretch. You go back to Patrick Kennedy and to others, you see the costs of empire are important to calculate. So what else are they doing there? They inserted a rather small expeditionary force. It is 28 planes officially published, some helicopters, Su-24, Su-25s, ground support, MiG-29s, and Su-30s, I think, or 34s, for air superiority. And air superiority works. We saw American fighters and Turkish fighters running away from the Russians. I talked to a very senior general last night and said, "Sir, what do you make of the Russian salvo of the Cascade cruise missiles from the Caspian?" There's a lot of chatter that it wasn't really from the Caspian, maybe it was from the Mediterranean. I do not have that access and clearance, but let's assume for a second this is what I called the Tomagovsky. The Tomahawk-style 26 missiles launched from the Caspian. What are you making of that? I asked this very senior general. "Oh," he said, "we're very surprised." So we keep being surprised by the Russians who really are letting their hair down. And among other things, having an Air Force regiment, a Spetsnaz detachment there, anti-aircraft, it creates a bridgehead into which both Russia and Iran can project power. They can project power into Syria, and the question is, one, how much power do they need to have a tipping point and to really break the back of the Sunni insurgent? Two, what kind of reaction we're going to have from Turkey? Turkey already ran to NATO and cried uncle, but I'm not so sure that NATO today, with a rather meek response in Ukraine, is willing to engage Russia in out of area, in Syria. Then the question is, to what extent is our interest to stand in Russia's way if Russia really engages ISIS? And we can hammer them. Why are you not engaging ISIS? Why are you hitting these guys? And of course, they pretend that they don't understand the difference between the ISIS and non-ISIS. And by the way, non-ISIS are not exactly the angels. Al-Nusra, for example, the Al-Qaeda spin-off, is not necessarily the good guys. I was on Russian TV. I normally don't go on Russian TV, but here it was just too precious to miss, with Vyacheslav Nikonov, the grandson of his namesake, his grandfather Vyacheslav Molotov, who is advising Putin on foreign policy, and Maria Zakharova, the Russian version of Jen Psaki, the Russian young and attractive spokeswoman for the foreign ministry. And Nikonov, without batting an eyelash, said, "Well, you were screwing around with the thing for 4.5 years. Get out of our way and let Putin do the job, and Obama is, you know, whatever he is." So I think this is jingoistic. I think this is irresponsible. I would not like to see a clash in Syria that we don't know where it will lead. All the chatter about how the Russian nuclear deterrent is all rusted up, I do not believe it. They test all the time the rockets. They shoot rockets from the European part of Russia to Kamchatka. That's 10,000 clicks, something like that. So a nuclear war, an accidental nuclear war, is probably not a good idea. But at the same time, letting Russia run amok in Syria is not a good idea either. So why are they doing that? I mean, this is a high-risk behavior. First of all, commentators that looked at Ukraine and the reasons for Ukraine indicated that by losing internal legitimacy, Putin needed external justification for his rule to boost his own popularity. And that was accomplished in Ukraine. About 80%, you have different polls, but 80 to 80+% of people polled support Putin and supported the adventure in Ukraine. With Syria, Putin personally, the popularity goes up. The engagement in Ukraine is not in Syria is not popular. That's first interesting piece of data. Only 30% support, 60% again, 10% undecided, and this is before what the Russians called the zinc cans, the coffins, start getting back to Russia. And to be absolutely cynical, to quote Stephen Cook of the Council of Foreign Relations in his article, Let Putin Bleed, I would say teaching Russia a lesson about inadvisability of adventures like that may probably cross somebody's mind in Washington and in Riyadh and in Ankara. And the way people in the Middle East fight, they fight dirty, and I will not be surprised that these zinc coffins will start going back to Russia one way or another, especially the ground element around Latakia and Tartus. And of course, if they try to deploy broader, bigger land forces, that Mr. Putin is on record many, many times saying they will not do that. What else I can tell you? I can tell you that the Putin-Obama meeting in the UN, I was in New York that day, it did not go well. There was no agreement. There was no joint strategy of any kind. And I will not totally rule out some kind of understanding about ISIS. ISIS potentially is probably more dangerous to Russia because they can walk there. They can drive there as opposed to the United States, unless, of course, we do what our European allies do, which is open the borders and let tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people just appear on our doorstep. I was in Germany a month ago at a conference, speaking at a conference in Berlin, talked to some very senior German officials. And I asked two questions. Being a Washington wonk, I said, so, Herr Klaus, what was the interagency process that led to that decision? And he said, two. I said, Herr Schmidt, what are the filters, the security filters that you screen these people? And he said, so ladies and gentlemen, we've been in this business for a while. What do you call a decision in which up to 1 million people can show up in your country with no distinction who is an economic refugee and who is an economic migrant and who is a legitimate refugee from a conflict as the international law defines it? And two, how you evaluate whether your country can or cannot absorb that mass of people. And three, why only 1/3 of these people are from Syria? And the rest are from Bangladesh and Afghanistan and Sudan and all kinds of places. Because those countries are poor is not necessarily in the international law a justification for you to settle them to the tune of 500 euros a month, housing, healthcare, education, and all that. And if you're rich Germany, okay, that's your decision. But if you're not so rich, if you are a Central European country, if you're a Baltic state, if you're Slovakia, that people are toiling for 600 euros a month salary at the car plant or something like that, how can they impose that? And from the Putin's point of view, I circle back to Syria, that's great. They impose sanctions on Russia. Europeans did. We impose sanctions on Russia. And now, all of a sudden, millions of people show up and knock on their doors. Don't knock on their doors. Just open these doors and just walk in and say, hello, I'm going to live here now. So the destabilization of Turkey, destabilization of European countries, especially a country like Greece, for example, that was a basket case before that, an economic basket case, with hundreds of thousands of refugees. I'm trying to sort of get into Putin's mind and think, well, he kept saying that EU is not viable. He kept saying that, you know, the European civilization is weak, and now he's just giving it that push. Being surrounded by Eurabia for Russia, probably not a good idea either. So I did not come to a conclusion on that yet, but that is very, very destabilizing for our European allies that we, among other things, are farming out our Ukraine policy to and expecting them to do good things vis-à-vis Ukraine. To conclude, I think we are in a new era. I think this is a paradigm shift. I think Russia is coming back to play a role that is similar to the Soviet role in Eastern Hemisphere, projecting power, being a spoiler, and shooting its way to the negotiating table for the contingencies if and when we need to sit down and settle things in Syria and elsewhere.
Sure.
Okay, questions?
Dan?
Two things. First, you mentioned Egypt and Russia. Could the relationship between Egypt and Russia be sabotaged by the Syrian activity? I mean, Egyptians really don't like this shared front very much.
The Egyptians are on the record supporting the Russian mission in Syria, and the Islamist aspect of the Sunni insurgency irks the Egyptians. Some of these groups are supported by Turkey. The relationship between Mr. Erdogan and General Sisi is terrible. I think the diplomatic relationship was broken, was recalled at some point. They trade accusations, they call each other names. And also I think what the United States did in the aftermath of the military takeover in Egypt caused Mr. Sisi to rethink the strategic relationship. The Saudis are not necessarily very happy with the United States. The Saudis are big supporters of the Sisi regime. So, no, I think that at this point at least, the Egyptians are taking a very interesting position because Saudis and the Gulfis, Qataris and others are a part of the Sunni coalition, different parts. They all have their proxies there. The Egyptians are much closer to the Assad and to the Russian position, but when push comes to shove, the Sunni Egyptians do not like the Shia Iranians. So if Iran is increasing the shadow that it casts in the Middle East, I can see the friction between Egypt and Iran developing.
Really quickly, one of the motives for this Syria adventure is probably to take the spotlight off Ukraine and to make that a lesser footnote. Is that going to work?
Well, first of all, I think Ukraine is very important. And I was beating the drum for Ukraine even before the Maidan thing occurred. The Russians are freezing that conflict. There's not a lot of fighting going on. And I think that right now, the idea is to freeze it in such a way that they make sure that Ukraine is not a candidate for NATO membership, that Ukrainians are punished for removal of the Russian protege, Mr. Yanukovych, that the conflict is not just frozen, but Kiev is stuck with a bill because the Minsk agreement, that Minsk II agreement that Frau Merkel and Monsieur Hollande negotiated with Putin is talking, it can be interpreted. There's some, so they are trying to stick the Ukrainians with the bill for those folks who rebelled against Ukraine with Russian support. And it's really not a good idea because there's like 2.5 million people there that would need education, social security, health, etc. So that's how Russia sees it. So I think Russia, and I don't think, I know, Russia did not expect the ferocity of Ukrainian resistance. Russia is still waiting for the economic situation in Ukraine to deteriorate further so that the government and the president would be removed. There's polarization between people who fought in the war and people who profit from the war. The oligarchs are still there. The corruption is still there. It is not a happy story, but Russia expected a big Slavic Brotherhood rebellion all the way to Odessa and the Romanian border. So the whole south of Ukraine, Russia expected to fall into their lap like Donetsk and Luhansk, and it didn't happen.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to ask for clarification from your presentation. On one hand, you suggested that the U.S. shouldn't allow Russia to, I think, run amok in Syria, which was your characterization. But then on the other hand, you suggested that we should let Russia bleed from this experience. Another characterization. So those seem to be potentially opposing viewpoints, or could lead to opposing actions. So what do you recommend that the U.S. do? What actions do you think you recommend the U.S. take militarily in Syria and Ukraine?
Well, there's a discussion, as you probably saw, about the no-fly zone in the north. And again, this is not something that, I'm not engaged with or advising a military command right now. And I've done some U.S. military work too, but not right now, not on this issue. But if that no-fly zone is implementable and realistic, you need to start draw some lines and stick to them, because what appears now, we had this red line about the chemical weapons, and then we sort of walked away from it. And I think what it is, it's sort of a perception management with a muscle. So you need to have a muscle, you need to have a line, and you need to manage Russian perceptions of our strengths or weakness with a muscle. So, for example, if we think we can protect that no-fly zone, we should do it.
How is a no-fly zone consistent with not allowing an American plane to come within 25 miles of a Russian plane? We're talking about a no-fly zone in the context in which American pilots are directed to not fly within 20 miles.
Well, then that's a Russian no-fly zone. Yeah.
Could I just ask on something you touched on there a moment ago in terms of Russia wanting to bleed Ukraine more?
Mm-hmm.
As you know very well, one of the things that they've done in the past under Putin is the energy weapon.
Right.
Is that now off the table for some reason, or do you expect that to be played?
It is less acute.
Weather gets worse.
It's less acute than before. A couple of things are going on. Number one, the European energy consumption is going down. It is economic efficiency is going up. They find ways to improve the energy efficiency. 2014, Europe brought 20% less natural gas than 2013, for example. Second of all, Ukraine now has reverse flow interconnectors. So this is pipelines that can bring some amount of gas, not a lot, from the West. So they had an agreement, they signed an agreement, it looks like the agreement will go through. The Ukrainian economy is extremely energy inefficient, and the money to buy Russian gas would come from the IMF and from the Western European loans. In addition to that, they are now negotiating purchase of 2 BCM, 2 billion cubic meters, of gas from Russia in addition to the existing agreement. Don't ask me how you have de facto state of war and you're still trading gas. Would the U.S. sell coal to Japan, to Imperial Japan, when we had the war with Japan? Probably not. Right? Would the British Empire sell coal to Germany or oil? I mean, they ran out of oil, the Nazis. Right? They had the Fischer-Tropsch process that They took coal and processed it into tank fuel and essentially gasoline, synthetic gasoline. But they were pushed to do that. Ukrainians are buying that gas. And I was involved in that. It's messy. The Turks did not allow liquid natural gas to float through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, through the Bosphorus, because Istanbul is sitting right there in the middle. So, but by bringing price, it's also a price game. By bringing prices up to the non-subsidized level, by stopping subsidization of natural gas, by increasing energy efficiency, by not wasting 20 years and bringing alternatives such as gas from Azerbaijan, such as gas via Turkey. And we needed to do more. The U.S. needed to push Erdogan on that. And now pipelines from Europe, they can walk away within 5 years from their dependence on Russian gas. Wow. And I have a monograph coming out of the U.S. Army War College just on this topic, either in December or January. So stay tuned.
Excellent. Yes, sir.
Back to your strategic discussion. I mean, I agree that that Putin wants to be the Soviet Union, but there are a couple of facts that are a problem for him. Putin has 130, 140 million people. The Soviet Union had 280 million. Right. Putin's economy compares to ours no better than the Soviet economy compared to ours.
Worse.
Probably worse.
Smaller, much smaller.
Well, you can't trust any of the
Right.
statistics.
Well,
but anyway, so it's way down.
Yep.
And then the other thing is, and you sort of touched on it, I believe a historic thing happened. And it's not just the Russians didn't get the revolution they wanted in Ukraine. I think they finally created a Ukrainian nationalism that's cohesive, though they'll quarrel among themselves, and it's anti-Russian now. And so wouldn't you say that actually there may be a strategic defeat hidden in here for Putin in Ukraine? And the other thing is, wouldn't you say that he's got imperial overstretch from day one because he just doesn't have the resources to sustain it? What we need, of course, is a president who will play all these cards. He's got the ace, king, and queen, but Obama won't play them.
You're right. A robust U.S. foreign policy probably would have prevented this mess, both in Ukraine and in Syria, if Russia knew that there'll be a price to be paid beyond what they're paying. Now, what really hurts the Russian economy now is not the sanctions, it's the low oil prices. And that really hurts them bad. But it hurts other people. It hurts the Iranians, it hurts Venezuelans very, very badly. But how long this is going to be the case? One of the commentary I read and really made me sort of wonder is that the more Russia is pushing into Syria, the more Saudi will get involved. And what the Russians are after, and this is a speculation, is a clash between the Saudis and the Iranians that will lead to a potential closure or fighting in the Persian Gulf. That, ladies and gentlemen, will start driving the oil prices up. But the other thing is, in terms of power projection in Russia is popular because it resonates with deeply set nationalist feelings in Russia. This is what Carl Jung wrote about, what is collective subconscious? Is that the right term? Yeah, no, that's the right term, right? So it really deeply resonated, just like certain things resonated in Germany in 1920s and 30s and had to be battered back. That genie was pushed back into the bottle. And being in Berlin a month ago, talking to some very senior people, they're saying, well, yeah, it was pushed back, but we still have, some kind of Nazi sympathizers in the police force all over the place, especially in the East. So Putin got the genie out of the bottle, and he is riding, to mix metaphors, riding that tiger of imperialist nationalism. And Ukraine is no match for them. I mean, if we don't support the Ukrainians, which I think we should, because I've been to Kiev like 5 times since this whole thing started. It's a revolution of decent people. I mean, yeah, there were some fringes there. There's some ultra-nationalists, and they still did not sort out their own history from the 1930s and 40s. And horrible things were done in the blood fields of Ukraine. But it's students, it's professionals, it's people who want Ukraine to be a European country in the good sense. I would say that revolution is not over yet. Brett?
Ariel, this has really been a great presentation. I have 2 quick questions for you. What do you think the possibility is that Putin is intending a limited intervention in Syria to prop up the Assad regime and to maybe strike a de facto arrangement with ISIS, in which ISIS will do its thing in the west of the country and Putin will consolidate Assad in the west of the country? And second, what is your interpretation of the recent call by the Iraqi government for Russian airstrikes?
But this is a contradiction here, because the Iraqi government is calling for Russian airstrikes against ISIS. What you're suggesting is a de facto deal with ISIS. And the question is to what extent ISIS is really motivated by crazy extremist religious beliefs, and what is the process of ISIS becoming a realpolitik force. And I don't think anybody has an answer to that question. But the other thing is, besides ISIS, there would be players in Syria who would attack Russia. People who are supported by Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qataris. And to what extent we can really coordinate them, to what extent my optimism and belief in good planning and good conduct of our foreign policy in Syria is just, over the last 4.5 years, think about it, look at it. And by the way, and maybe Frank will just jump at me and fight, I think what we did in Libya is nothing to boast about. I mean, Libya was a disgusting dictatorial regime, but look at it now. The more Islamists there, manpads are leaking out, other weapons are leaking out. There are elements of Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, ISIS running all over Libya. If this is how we conduct Middle East interventions, maybe really we should stay back and let these dictators in place. I don't know. And in terms of Iraq, after I think I just was frustrated, put something on Facebook. I said, after 12 years of engagement in Iraq, Frank, what was it, about $1 trillion bill, right? We have the Iraqi government now inviting Russians to take over the base, the Air Force base that we abandoned in 2011. The Obama administration walked away without status of forces agreement in Iraq. That's like if a student, if I taught a course and a student wrote that to me in a BA Introduction to International Relations course, I would probably not give him a good mark if he suggested that. Frank, are you going to jump at me?
No, I'm not going to challenge you at all. I think you're right on that. Let me, if I may, ask you a question about something that's long puzzled me about Putin, and that is, you use the metaphor of riding the tiger. I think the next line is in the hopes that we're feeding the tiger in the hopes you'll be eaten last. I don't quite understand if you think he has a longer-term plan, what it would be with respect to what seems to be a building. And I've had it explained to me that this sort of Shiite crescent that he's perhaps engineering is at least partly designed to try to contend with his Sunni problem internally, and that may yet develop in some of the former Soviet republics to the east. So there's that problem that is festering for sure. It may become much, much more problematic in the future. And something you haven't talked about today, because it wasn't on the topic, but just while we've got you, the degree to which he seems to be, with respect to the Chinese, enabling them to be a much more formidable problem down the road, whether it's in Siberia or whether it's with respect to their own military capabilities, some of which at least have come from Russia. So would you address the sort of, at what point does he worry about getting eaten, or does he not think that far down the road?
That is, this tells me that Frank Gaffney is a very astute observer of foreign policy. And I mean, this has an added advantage of being the truth. Frank, a lot of people who know Putin or work for Putin say Putin is a very good tactician. And to me also, he often uses this judo tactic, because he has a black belt in judo, of getting closer to somebody and then doing the move. Exhibit 1 is what he did in Syria when Obama was up the tree about the chemical weapons. He got closer to Obama and said, you know, I'm from the Kremlin, I'm here to help you. Okay. In Syria, we were upset. We're saying we're upset about ISIS, but we're not really doing the job. Said, okay, here's Mother Russia. Mother Russia has this cudgel and is going to do the job. Okay, wham. And by the way, other people, we don't distinguish. They all have beards and they're all terrorists. They were all bad, to quote the governor of California, former governor. So in terms of longer term, it gets much trickier, because Mr. Putin is a Europeanist. That's what he was trained in. He is an intelligence officer. He knows how to operate with what they call human material, how to recruit, how to run people. So if you are a retired German chancellor and you have your qualities and values, maybe you will chair a Gazprom affiliate with a pipeline to Germany, etc., etc. He has this personal relation. Berlusconi and some French politicians, I've seen them in action. He is not a Middle East hand. The last one the Russians had, and I actually have a distinction of being threatened by him personally, was Yevgeny Primakov, and he died. And he did not really understand or knew much about the Islamists. He was from the era of Ba'ath and secular dictatorial regimes and secular terrorists like Yasser Arafat. That's who he dealt with, and he funded them. Russia does not seem to have very good, very deep understanding of this turmoil that the Middle East is in. Probably they're listening to the Iranians. The Iranians do understand. I mean, I don't like them, but they do understand that they lived there for only 3,000, 4,000 years. And now the Egyptians will be feeding them some information as well. And it's going to be anti-Islamists, including anti-MB, which I don't have a problem with that. I think they see the Saudis as an adversary in the oil world because they cannot cut a deal with the Saudis. The Saudis are driving the oil prices down, and this is bad for all kinds of people. This is bad for mom and pop firms in Texas and in Bakken and North Dakota. But it's also bad for Rosneft and Gazprom and Venezuelan communists and stuff like that. So I do not know. But at the same time, the Russians said a thing in this television debate that I had, and I sort of swallowed and did not fight back. They said, we the Russians, consistently had better understanding and analysis of the Middle East than you guys. And I remember, that's not difficult, I remember Mikhail Margelov, who was the chairman of the Upper House Foreign Affairs Committee, was a teacher of Arabic in KGB Academy, met Saddam Hussein the first time he was 18, is a scion of a very prominent security family. The Margelovs, the grandfather was the founder of the Russian air assault force, Soviet air assault forces, was engaged in planning of Soviet assault on the United States, and the father was 3-star in SVR. And Margelov, pretty much point by point in 2003, before our engagement in Iraq, said, Sunni Shia, do not demobilize the military. So he gave me an amazingly accurate prediction of what would happen, and it happened. And yeah, maybe they do have better human intelligence and better assets on the ground in Syria, including, that's their guys for a long time. So if we need, I think that the take home at this stage, we need to shape up and get our game way up in Syria and in the Middle East. Between the Russians and the Iranians, we have two major chess grandmasters. The Iranians invented the games, and the Russians had the champions for a long time. We better watch it. Thank you very much.